What's going on, family? Welcome back to the From the Bottom FS channel, man. Today we're gonna cover some infographics. You guys were requesting this one down below. Why Osama bin Laden attacked the U.S. All right, now we always have what our media tells us the answers to the question is. Let's just see what infographics. Let's just see their perspective. Let's go.
Osama bin Laden went down in history for his obsession with attacking the United States and its allies, never giving up on his mad quest until he was finally gunned down by SEAL Team 6 in 2011. But why was this terrorist mastermind so obsessed with the United States? Why did he attack the US in the first place? If you ask many intellectuals, they'll tell you that most terrorists aren't powerful criminals, but rather people driven by desperation to strike out against a government they view as oppressing them. This applied to many of bin Laden's henchmen, who were sponsored by Al-Qaeda's inner circle to train in its terror camps. But it did not apply to Osama bin Laden. Osama grew up in Saudi Arabia in the lap of luxury. As the son of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, to say that the elder bin Laden was a success would be putting it lightly. He was a billionaire construction magnate who ensured his family was well taken care of, his very large family at that. Osama bin Laden was born in 19...
So that's kind of interesting because, I always thought that, he kind of grew up in the trenches, you know what I mean? He had a deep hatred because of something we did to him behind the scenes, or we were doing to their country behind the scenes. But to see that he kind of grew up rich is a different viewpoint. Let's get into it.
57, as a son of Mohammed bin Laden's 10th wife. In total, his father had 52 children. His mother divorced the billionaire soon after Osama was born, but Osama would ultimately inherit at least $25 million from his father. So, he was well taken care of. But where did his radicalism begin? The bin Laden family was devoutly religious, but followed a mainstream version of the Sunni Muslim faith. They were well assimilated into Saudi culture, and no one would expect one of the clan to become an infamous terrorist. He didn't follow a career path that would lead to extremism either. If you knew him back in the 70s, you would have known him as a mild-mannered economics and business student in King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. He graduated, although reports vary on what he majored in. But we do know he briefly attended a class at Oxford. Those who knew him reported he was passionate about poetry, military history, and soccer. So, how did it all go so horribly wrong? It all started when he left college in 1979, and he went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. The invasion of Afghanistan had galvanized him to become a political radical, but he had no reason to hate the United States at that point. In fact, the US and the Soviet Union were bitter enemies. The groups he worked with, like the Mujahideen, had even received financial support from the United States as they battled to hold the Soviets at bay. The Saudis provided support against the Soviets as well, and it seemed like bin Laden's interests were well in line with those of the larger Western countries. But then, something changed. By the time Osama bin Laden became a public name in the West due to a series of escalating terror attacks against US interests, his motivations had dramatically changed, and so had his status in the world. His turn to anti-West radicalism had led to his Saudi citizenship being revoked. After all, the Saudis greatly valued their alliance with the United States, particularly due to their rivalry with Iran, and they didn't want to be associated with a wild card. Bin Laden found himself a stateless terrorist, finding refuge in countries like Sudan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and he would only surface occasionally to make threatening videotapes. And on these videotapes, his motivation started to become clearer. What turned the son of a Saudi billionaire construction magnate into a terrorist radical? Bin Laden gave many explanations, and not all of them really matched up. Not long after the 9/11 attack,
Because if you think about it, it really don't add up, man. You grew up with money, you grew up in a nice environment. It had to have been something deeper, something more wheat to the story. It had to have been.
many explanations, and not all of them really matched up. Not long after the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden released his first new videotape taking credit for the attacks, and he singled out one main reason for the attack. This was the Israeli-Palestinian...
I remember, and that was a big deal too, man. That was a huge deal. They had us in class. I think they stopped class, man. They turned on the TVs. They brought TVs. Back in the day, they had to wheel the TVs on the little cart into the TV room, into the classroom, and they stopped class, man. They showed that 9/11 nonsense, man. And as a kid, that was insane to watch in real time. It almost seemed unreal to a certain extent. Like, this can't really be happening. Twin Towers really can't be burning right now. I'm about to fall down, and you know, as it did.
conflict, which had been raging for over 50 years at that point. If you ask the Israelis, they had fended off a genocidal war of invasion against a newborn country and taken the territory they needed to defend themselves. If you ask the Palestinians or the surrounding Arab states, they'd been expelled from their territory by newcomers to the region and had been fighting to get their lands back ever since. But was this regional conflict enough to create a global war? In a word, probably not. While the Israeli-Palestinian conflict always makes emotions run high, just ask anyone in the comments section in an article about Gal Gadot. It was also a relatively small-scale conflict. The conflict over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Jewish Temple Mount was likely the most concerning to a religious zealot like bin Laden, but there was one problem with the idea that this was his motivation. Prior to this video, he had never mentioned the conflict before. The odds are that after striking his biggest blow yet against the US and becoming public enemy #1, he was hoping that bringing up this hot topic would get him more support from the countries in the region. But other conflicts may have had more to do with his radicalization. The Gulf War was one of the largest conflicts of the 1990s, with the United States ultimately stopping Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, but leaving the Iraqi dictator in power. Saddam was infamous for his brutal treatment of minority groups like the Kurds and frequently attacked U.S. planes entering his airspace. Iraqi forces even attempted to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush shortly after he left office. So the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq as long as Saddam refused to cooperate with international authorities, and this led to a trade embargo and widespread suffering in Iraq. And that was enough to get bin Laden deeply angry.
But to me, that doesn't make. I mean, it's like for him to logically get upset about that. It's like these are the decisions of your own country. You know what I mean? You guys chose to take this route, and these are the consequences. You know, we stopped the trading with you guys. We stopped trading around your country. So it's kind of self-inflicted, if you ask me. Let's get back into it.
1998 fatwa against Americans, claiming that over 1 million Iraqis had been killed by the sanctions and saying that targeting civilians was permissible due to this carnage. But bin Laden had no direct ties to the Iraqis and had never fought in the country, and in fact, Saddam was a very different sort of radical to him. Saddam led a military dictatorship that had no real alliance with Islamic radical groups, and when he was deposed by the United States a few years later, it created an opening for Al-Qaeda in the country. So bin Laden basing his entire worldview around this issue would seem unlikely. But other conflicts were on his radar as well. Bin Laden's manifesto also mentioned countless conflicts regarding Muslims in the world. They included Russia's oppression of the Chechen Muslim minority in the Soviet Union, the ongoing border conflict in Kashmir between Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan, the Philippine government's conflict with Muslim groups, and Israel's ongoing northern border conflict with Lebanon. In each of these cases, bin Laden said the United States was aiding these groups to oppress Muslims. There was just one problem with that. The U.S. had little to nothing to do with any of these conflicts.
Right.
While they were allies with some of the countries, the government had little to do with them. In Russia,
It's kind of like, to me, he's just trying to find a reason to be mad at America, bro. That's pretty much what I get from it. He's just trying to find a reason. And none of the reasons seem logical. I mean, so I don't know if he was just jealous of America's success versus his country, like how Americans live like this, but my people live like this kind of thing. You know what I mean? You guys let me know your perspective. Comment down below. Let's get back into it.
while they were allies with some of the countries, the government had little to do with them. In Russia's assault on Chechnya, the U.S. had frosty relationships with its geopolitical rival, at best, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. The one exception was bin Laden's mention of the conflict in Somalia, where U.S. involvement led to a bloody conflict that was immortalized in the movie Black Hawk Down. But none of these conflicts were particularly close to bin Laden, and his inclusion of them started to look more like a list of grievances than a smoking gun. He had one complaint that didn't match the others though, and this one might have had some right-wing Americans nodding along. In his 2002 letter to America, his first time communicating with the outside world after the 9/11 attacks, he decided to broaden his complaints to America's domestic conduct. But he didn't accuse them of oppressing Muslim Americans. Instead, he went on a rant about America's immorality. Some of his complaints included the country's support of promiscuous sex, gay rights, alcohol and drugs, and gambling. He also oddly complained about trading with interest prohibited in Islam, but something common in banking around the world. Was Osama bin Laden suddenly becoming a culture critic? While many anti-American radicals do criticize America,
Or he could have been doing that on purpose to try to divide America up more to make it weaker, I guess, as a collective there, which would have been a smart idea. I mean, that can go either way. Let's get back into it.
Laden suddenly becoming a culture critic? While many anti-American radicals do criticize America's domestic policies, in addition to its foreign policies, while not being fully fledged terrorists, this appears to be another case like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where bin Laden seemed to generate a new grievance after the attacks that put him on the world stage. It's unlikely that this was his primary grievance that motivated the attacks, but a savvy propagandist like bin Laden might have put it in the manifesto to set Americans against each other. After all, if right-wing Americans start blaming the gay rights movement for terror attacks, maybe they'll be too busy fighting with each other to find him. But most experts believe one factor motivated him more than any other. The year was 1991, and Saddam Hussein had invaded the oil-rich Persian Gulf state of Kuwait. Even though we've already discovered that Saddam Hussein didn't fully support bin Laden's cause, the roots of his rage might be tied to the war anyway. The US and Saudi Arabia were closely aligned, and the Saudis quickly invited US troops onto their soil to launch their attacks on Iraq from there, and to provide some insurance in case Saddam decided to take his quest for oil even further. And when the war ended, the US stuck around. From 1992 to 2003, the US had around 5,000 troops stationed in Saudi Arabia, mostly to conduct air operations over Iraq. While Saddam had been pushed back, there had never been any formal peace agreement, and he continued to behave aggressively toward his neighbors. This was something the Saudis agreed to and in fact invited. Their security was endangered by Saddam as well, and business relations with the US were important to both countries. The US presence was vital to protecting the shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf. So, why did this fill bin Laden with rage? Simple. The US agreed, the Saudis agreed, but no one asked him. While most people involved felt that the security benefits were worth it, Osama bin Laden viewed even the voluntary presence of US troops on Saudi soil as an invasion of holy Muslim land. While the troops were nowhere near the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina, they were too close for this radical. And there is ample evidence that this might have been the trigger that turned him into an anti-American militant. For one thing, it was the only motivation mentioned in the very first fatwa he issued in 1996, demanding the US evacuate Saudi Arabia. 2 years later, he referred to it as an invasion, in which the United States had been plundering the country and humiliating the people. He believed it was a staging ground for an assault on the entire Muslim world, and repeatedly accused the Americans of being too close to Mecca. The US presence in Saudi Arabia would eventually end when the Second War with Iraq began due to the Saudis opposing that conflict, but this was the only motivation that bin Laden kept coming back to. Which means, ironically, Osama bin Laden's reason for wanting to declare war on America might have been that his home country invited them in to protect them from a hostile neighbor. Of course, if you ask 10 people why Osama bin Laden hated America, you'll probably get 10 answers, and most of them will reflect on the person's opinions more than the truth.
I don't know. I kind of think it could be a combination of both. I think it had more so to do with the oil over there, man. And America was kind of sticking around, a little longer than we should have. And we had our troops over there for a long time. I'm not sure the exact, but I think it was a couple of years. But anyway, I think it was more so of the oil, in this case, and it could have been, we were on their land, we're on his territory, and if he does view our culture as toxic and just bad for human beings, he hates it. He would definitely hate it if we touched down in around his home, around his area, around his country. So I can see that.
Want to learn more about Osama bin Laden's beginnings? Check out how the CIA funded a terrorist organization, or watch how SEAL Team tracked down Osama bin Laden minute by minute for how it all came to an end.
All right, you guys, so that was why Osama bin Laden attacked the U.S. And now within this video, definitely want to fact check a few things behind the scenes, but I definitely, in my opinion, think it has something more to sort of do with the oil over there. I think Americans wanted the oil, or our country wanted the oil, and he wasn't having it. And I think the conversation of him believing we were a toxic culture and coming up over to his land and touching down, that's a real thing. I can believe in that one right there. So, but who knows? You guys let me know what you guys think down below. Of course, let's talk about it. Until next time, you guys already know. Y'all be easy out there. Peace.